And so now I want to kind of transition to talking a little bit about our wonderful guest speaker today, Allison Nelson. I met Allison 10 years ago when I first started here. She had spent some time working in our outreach department, and she was also a volunteer at our Coyote Creek field station. And at the field station, she also did her master's thesis work on hermit thrushes using her geolocator technology. And she got her master's in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from San Francisco State. And she has been a passionate studier and advocator for hermit thrushes ever since then. She's a federally permitted bird bander, and she has a great resume. She's the founder of the Gold Country Avian Studies. She's also worked, in addition to working for SFBBO, she's worked for Point Blue Conservation Science, the University of Queensland, San Francisco Estuary Invasive Spartina Project, Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, and many other places. But in addition to being a really smart scientist who's very dedicated to studying these birds, one of the things that really strikes me about Allison and talking with her is just her depth of empathy and love for hermit thrushes and her incredible commitment to this species over years, over a decade already. I think if every species had someone like Allison who is that focused and dedicated to protect them, then we would have a real great chance of protecting our biodiversity throughout the globe. And so I just want to thank Allison for her commitment and for her time today. I know she's very busy, but her time to share her story and information and love about hermit thrushes with all of us. I think all of us can remember in 2020, and I think it was in the fall, when we heard about the CZU Lightning Complex fire up at Big Basin and how that made all of us feel. And it was kind of a symbol of what wildfires are doing right now as part of climate change. And I spoke with Allison a few months ago about the continued research that she did up there last year to see what had happened to the hermit thrushes. It was a time when not many people were able to go there, but because she was permitted, she was able to be one of the first folks there to bear witness to see the effect the fires had on the species. And I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk today to let us know and sharing the dedication about continuing to keep our spotlight on this species and all of the species that are in these ecosystems with them, and continuing to call for us to support her work and the work that all of us are doing to conserve birds. So thank you, Allison, again for being here. We're looking forward to hearing you talk, and you can take it away.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. SFBBO and Coyote Creek Field Station was really where I learned to band birds, and it was a great experience for me. And I just have always had so much respect for the work you do and all the people who work for SFBBO. And so it's nice to be back here again and touch on the work on hermit thrushes that I did while I was volunteering at CCFS, and then also share kind of how that led to an additional geolocator study on birds at Big Basin, and then how I was able to take that data from my studies at Big Basin and use that to compare what was going on with hermit thrush populations after the CZU Lightning Complex fire. Yeah, so thank you. And we're actually gonna share a film that we made as part of as an educational component of the work we were doing, and that was funded by California State Parks Foundation, and it's short film. It's about 7.5 minutes long. So we're going to show that first because it's a really nice introduction to sort of the work that I've been doing in Big Basin and just the subspecies of hermit thrush that actually is in that in the park. I'm sorry if some of you may have already seen that, but we were really proud of it. We entered it into the Wild and Scenic Film Festival, and we just really wanted to, I think it really shares an important message about how we, I think so many people get so frustrated and overwhelmed that that they feel like they can't make a difference. And I just want to really share the message that I think everybody needs to do a little bit, even on a daily basis, even if it's just a couple minutes here or there, trying to move things forward so that we can really make some tangible change in the way things are heading right now. So yeah, so thanks for giving us the opportunity to share that. And I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen if you guys are ready. Thanks again for having me here. I just for those of you who aren't familiar with the hermit thrush, I hope that you really enjoyed hearing the song of the bird in the film. The song is really why I became enamored with this bird and why I chose to focus my research and studies over many years on this bird, and I hope to continue studying them for as long as I possibly can. I first discovered the hermit thrush when I was working for the Appalachian Mountain Club in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the late 90s. And so my work's just kind of progressed in different areas, focusing on this bird. But I'm gonna today talk about three main projects. One was a geolocator study of hermit thrushes wintering in the Bay Area. One was a geolocator project focusing on birds breeding in Big Basin Redwoods State Park in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And then the other is this post-fire research on the population of birds that were breeding in Big Basin. And then I'll touch on also a little bit about the genetics work that's been done and is planned for the future. So, and just to give you a little bit of a background on hermit thrushes in California, California is a fascinating place to study them because there are so many different subspecies that are found within the state. This map is a map of the breeding range of the bird within the state. So in the winter, they're fairly ubiquitous. You'll see them in your backyards and in gardens. But in the summer, the bird is really only found at higher elevation, sort of mountainous areas. They're really not in the Central Valley during the winter. So most of these, this subspecies map was really, we made this map based on historical literature that was primarily, the subspecies were primarily developed using skins collected by early ornithologists, and the subspecies were defined mostly based on morphology, wing length, color, etc. And so my focus has really been on this population here of the Catharus guttatus slevini. So Thomas Slevin was an amateur ornithologist who originally identified this subspecies based on a individual captured in Monterey County. Actually, south, the range of the bird has been reduced, probably mostly likely to development along the coast. So they're really, the birds are very rare to find in this southern coast of California, but moving up from sort of the Big Basin, Santa Cruz Mountain area, you can find them in the mountains along the coast, but somewhat sporadically. And one of the really interesting things is that it's in the literature, it's unclear where the northern extent of this subspecies is expected to be, is expected to terminate. So there's other subspecies present, and we just kind of don't know really where that break is. So that's one of the things that's always interested me about this particular grouping. So to tell you a little bit more about the geolocator work, our first geolocator project was actually funded by Point Blue Conservation Science, and they had 32 geolocators to put on hermit thrushes, and we put 10 of those on at the Coyote Creek Field Station in the South Bay. They put the rest on in the North Bay. And geolocators are, the way they work, they're attached to the bird like a little backpack, They record light levels every 5 minutes and timestamp those light levels. And then you need to recapture the bird, remove the tag, and then download all that data, which is actually used to estimate latitude and longitude locations. So of those 30 of the 32 devices that were deployed, we recovered and downloaded data from 10 units, 4 from the South Bay and 6 from the North Bay. And these devices, because they're used to estimate locations, we did not estimate the actual migratory pathways, but we did estimate the breeding destinations of these wintering birds that we had captured, basically January through early March, and that was in 2012 to 2013. So we found that you can see from the map here that the pink blobs represent sort of rough estimates of where the individual wintered. And so the pink blobs represent the 6 North Bay birds, and they went to this area of maybe Vancouver, Northern Washington, into the British Columbia. And then the 4 South Bay birds headed further north and ended up in this Alexander Archipelago area. So it's kind of an interesting example of leapfrog migration, where you have your southernmost wintering birds heading to the northernmost breeding locations, kind of hopping over the other individual population. So our the other geolocator project we performed was in Big Basin Redwoods State Park. And this is an excellent, this is just a beautiful park, which historically provided excellent habitat for hermit thrushes. There's just these beautiful old growth redwoods with the old growth Douglas firs, a thick understory of huckleberries, which the birds really loved. Great resource for them to fatten up on in the fall before they leave on migration. And then kind of a mid-story of tan oak, which I literally almost to a bird, every time I saw one singing was in a tan oak at about 10 to 15 feet high. And so not only did they provide perches, but they provide this leaf litter, which the birds are very well camouflaged against, and they turn the leaf litter over and look for insects and soft-bodied arthropods, etc. So in Big Basin, we had 2 field sites. One, the Creeping Forest Trail. This is for those of you who are familiar with the park. One was around the Creeping Forest Trail, and one was in the Blooms Creek Trail along the East Ridge, Blooms Creek area along the East Ridge Trail. So in Big Basin, we put on 20 geolocators, and then we actually got 13 back, which is a really great return rate. I actually haven't ever, I don't know of any studies that had such a great return rate. And so hermit thrushes exhibit something called really high site fidelity, where they come back to literally the same spot over and over again. So when we came back a year later to get these tags off the birds, we just put the net in the exact same location where we had placed it the year before, and we're able to catch many of the same individuals. So the birds from Big Basin ended up heading to Baja, Mexico, Baja California Sur, so the southern part of the peninsula, as well as the western coast of mainland Mexico. So while we were doing this geolocator work, we also took a lot of different morphological measurements, and consistent with the historical literature, we found that the wintering birds were bigger and darker than the smaller breeding birds in Big Basin. So the ones that winter, like in the areas like Coyote Creek Field Station, are larger and darker than the ones that breed in the coastal mountain ranges. They're breeding birds, the Catharus sloveni subspecies, is just a paler bird, and they interestingly, they're the smallest subspecies of hermit thrushes, but they have one of the longest bills, which is really interesting. Probably has something to do with thermal regulation or feeding habitats, etc. Feeding habits, etc. So one thing that these two combined studies did is confirmed a pattern of chain migration in hermit thrushes in the Bay Area. So what's really happening is you have, say, populations of hermit thrushes that are breeding up in southern Alaska, northwestern Washington, British Columbia. They head south for the winter and end up in the San Francisco Bay Area. At the same time that they're heading south for the winter to arrive in the Bay Area, a different population of birds that was breeding in the Coast Ranges is simultaneously heading south to end up in Mexico for the winter. So in spring migration, the opposite happens. So those Mexico wintering birds head north, end up in the San Francisco Bay Area, while the ones that were wintering in the San Francisco Bay Area head north and end up again in Alaska and various other locations in the Pacific Northwest. So unfortunately, in August of 2020, the CZU Lightning Complex fire struck Big Basin. 97% of the park burned. The containment date was not defined until December of 2020. And when I returned to the park in the summer of 2021, there were areas that were still burning. So even though the containment date was considered to be 4 or 5 months after when the fire started, when I returned to my sites, both of them actually had reburn areas where there were fires that were caused, restarts from root fires, et cetera, that traveled through the roots and up the trunks of the trees and relit the trees on fire. So really, really heavily impacted the park at a really tough time of year for birds when they're fattening up on migration. They've got young that they're possibly still feeding. They're taxed because this is the time of year when they need to start molting, regrowing feathers. So really, really challenging time for the birds to be hit with this event. So the first thing we did to try to get at an understanding of what happened, what was happening with the populations before and after the fire, was to create a habitat model to identify where, how much habitat was available to the birds before the fire. So we accessed GIS layers from the Pacific Veg Map project for Santa Cruz and San Mateo counties, because the park spans those two counties. We restricted our model to the park boundaries. And then we combined elements including canopy cover, canopy height, and something called an enhanced life form map. And we utilized the redwood Douglas fir class to restrict the habitat to restrict the habitat for the hermit thrushes for the model. So what we ultimately came up with was, of the park's 18,223 acres, again, this is pre-fire, 15,893 acres were sufficient habitat for the hermit thrushes. They don't tend to use areas like those kind of ridge top chaparral areas or more developed areas. We obviously eliminated things like streets and parking lots, et cetera. So anyhow, that was the pre-fire estimate and the model we created using these GIS layers. Then post-fire, we used Sentinel-2 satellite data, which was imagery which was collected soon after the fire occurred. And that satellite imagery measured the severity of the fire. So the fire severity measures the loss of the organic vegetative matter caused by the fire. And then the data layer that we received was broken down into 4 fire severity codes from low severity to high severity, and areas that were reburned later on. We did receive information on that from the park, and then reclassified those reburn areas. Like if it was low originally, we reclassified those as high severity to kind of figure out how much of the park was hit with high severity fire versus low, et cetera. And so you can kind of see by our chart down here that about 64% of the park was hit with high severity fire impacts. So these photos, just to give you a quick example of what that might look like. So these photos were taken about 8 months after the fire hit. This photo on the left is about as good as it gets at Big Basin. So this would be what you would maybe consider a low severity fire. So the tan oaks in that kind of mid or understory area. So most of what was above ground, other than the redwoods, most of what was above ground died. So the tan oaks are bent over. They may, in the low severity areas, they may have retained vegetation that is just scorched, and the branches are singed. Those trees you can see in some of the pictures that they're starting to resprout from the bases. So the trunk and all of that will eventually fall and has died, but there are resprouts starting. So things like the huckleberries, the tan oaks, and the redwoods are resprouting. Unfortunately, the Douglas firs, other than a couple of areas where there was some lower severity fire, I would guesstimate that probably less than 24 Douglas firs survived, but they will not resprout. The Douglas firs, even the old growth huge ones, have died. So there will really be very few, if any, Douglas firs in Big Basin moving forward. And I think a lot of people don't realize that when they go to these old growth forests, like Big Basin, that there's a mix of redwoods and Doug fir there. The redwoods themselves lost a lot of the lateral branches. So Big Basin is now, for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit it, so many of the lateral branches were lost that the redwoods really no longer have that kind of traditional redwood shape. And the forest is now very open. It's not this kind of closed, dark forest. It's very open, and there's a lot of sunlight hitting the floor. So plants like ceanothus, which were not able to grow before, are now thriving in these areas. This area on the right is one of my sites where there was a reburn, and really just, it was just hit so hard, there's really nothing left. So the ground, there's really no, there was really no organic matter left. The whole forest floor was just ash, and then the dead leaves and needles from the trees fell and kind of have started creating this layer of new organic matter on the forest floor. So to get at the pre-fire territory density, I'm going to start talking about now how we are kind of comparing the population before and after the fire. So what we did to estimate the pre-fire territory density of hermit thrushes, we utilized the locations and capture numbers for the target netting that we did in the geolocator and other research that I did in the park from 2013 through 2015. So each of these dots represents a net location, and the number next to it is the number of unique males captured at that location. So we were using unique males as a proxy for a territory holding mated pair. We didn't consider the females separately. We caught very few females. They're usually kind of hiding out on nests and being very much more secretive. And then, so we had this kind of capture data for 3 years, 2013, 2014, 2015. We calculated a territory density for each year, averaged that, and then we expanded that across the park to estimate a number of hermit thrush territories across the entire habitable area of the park that we had estimated with that original habitat model. So the average territory density that we came up with was 0.134 territories per acre, which ends up being about 2,000 territories in the whole park, or 4,000 birds. And that's probably a little bit on the high side, because birds are concentrated in this kind of creek area. There may have been unmated males that were attracted in as well. It's possible that there were also males that we didn't pull in with the lures. When we're target netting, you basically set up a net and set up a lure call of the bird near the net, which and sometimes we have a decoy bird, and it draws them into the net. So then post fire, to get at this territory density number, we did what's called spot mapping. And when you're spot mapping, you have a transect. We use the trails that we had used in the past essentially as a transect. And then all hermit thrush detections or observations are recorded. Those are grouped, all those detections are grouped into territories, individual territories if possible, primarily using countersinging. So I think I mentioned that in the film previously, but males will from adjacent territories will sing, and so you can usually use that, sing together, and you can use that to identify sort of territory boundaries. And this is one of the things that's just so magical about this species, is that they countersing and they have multiple birds singing at the same time. And sometimes there's it's called song matching, where they'll match notes and mimic each other, and it's just exquisite. So anyhow, so we group these detections into different territories. Then we use something called a convex hull to create these kind of geometries, essentially like taking a rubber band and stretching it around all the detections that we had. This map here is the trail. This is one of the sites, and these were the territories that I identified at that one site. This is post-fire again. So then what we did to identify the territory density, so we've identified the territories, to identify the territory density, we again treated those trails as transects and buffered them by 150 meters, like we did with the target netting locations. And then we identified the number of territories found within that buffered kind of study area within my sites. And so you can see in this map, this is the creeping forest site. The red areas are the high severity areas, and then the green and the yellow are the lower severity areas. So you can kind of see that activity, each of these purple blobs is a hermit thrush territory. So you can kind of see that the activity is really concentrated in these lower severity areas. They're not using the areas that have zero cover left. They're concentrated in these areas where there's the dead tan oak that has retained some foliage, because that's really the only cover that was offered in the park. And so because there are such unusual circumstances, the hermit thrushes were putting nests in some pretty interesting places. This picture on the left is it's actually a hanging branch with a clump of dead tan oak leaves at the base of it. And it's kind of like a little hammock, and they've placed a nest kind of in this hanging hammock. We had another hermit thrush that put a nest up in, there was a redwood tree that was hollow in the center, and it had been burned out, but there was a little kind of shelf within this kind of hollowed out area of the tree trunk. and the hermit thrush put the nest right up on this little kind of shelf. So basically these birds are making the best of kind of a bad situation, since there's so little cover left on the ground for them to place nests. And yeah. So so again, once we have created these study areas and identified these territories within each of the 2 sites, we use 3 methods to estimate a total number of post-fire territories in these kind of habitable, within the habitable areas that were originally identified. So I'm not going to get into all the details of the methods, but essentially remember our pre-fire estimate was 2,000 territories. Post-fire, we estimated around 1,000 post-fire territories. We did another thing called the utilization ratio method to get at the minimum number possible pre and post-fire territories. And that, so between the 3 methods, we saw between about a 48 to 62% decline in the number of hermit thrushes at the park. And I haven't analyzed the data, but I did go back last summer as well, just did one visit. And I would say just roughly that the number of hermit thrushes was again cut in half. So about a quarter of what they were 2 years ago. And that's pretty typical. That's for hermit thrushes from what we know of the studies, is that what we were finding here at this site is what has been found in other post-fire territories, that the birds will come in, they'll be concentrated in these lower severity fire areas. The first year after the fire, birds will come back to breed in higher numbers, but then in subsequent years, they won't return. And either it's because they didn't have the resources that they needed at the site, and so they didn't produce offspring. So there's no recruitment, there's no offspring coming back because they just didn't have successful nests, or maybe their nests failed and they relocated to a different location. So they basically abandoned the site. And then that's, you also have to consider the fact that many hermit thrushes probably perished in the fire. This picture is of a burned hermit thrush that a colleague took at a banding station they operate near Sacramento. And this was not a Big Basin bird, but this was one that was captured while the Dixie and Caldor fires were occurring. So even though, we tend to think that they can fly, they're going to escape, they'll be fine. But they're especially when it's a really high, fast-moving severity, fast-moving fire like this, there are a lot of birds who probably were not able to make it out of the area. So the declines that we're seeing at Big Basin are really consistent with changes, with the changes in hermit thrush distribution expected to be caused by climate change, as modeled by the California Avian Data Center. So this is an older map, but you can kind of see that this, at the time, this was 2014. This is what the current distribution of hermit thrushes, and then with climate change, they expect them to be essentially extirpated from south of the San Francisco Bay on up the coast, and even growing limited in these higher elevation areas. Just to touch on the genetics piece a little bit, we did, this map is a genoscape map, which is a map of genetic structure of a species across its breeding range. So this was taken from a paper I co-authored with Allison Alvarado. So just to kind of give you a quick explanation on what this is. So each of these different colors is a different genetically distinct grouping of birds. So kind of all across the Northeast and Northern Canada, you have kind of the same genetic group. Then in the West, you have a lot more structuring with a lot greater number of different groups. And these samples down here, or this area down here in orange, these were from blood samples that I collected in Big Basin and Point Reyes. So you can see that their range is pretty restricted. So they're genetically distinct and they're pretty restricted in their range. And so again, one of the things we want to try to do with this study is to figure out, how distinct they are and how far north their distribution extends. So as part of this study that was funded by California State Parks Foundation, I went and I did, and we have not analyzed these samples yet, but I went and I did go to collect blood samples at a number of other parks in Northern California. So here's Big Basin. Point Reyes was from a previous trip, but then we had these other parks throughout the north where we collected blood samples. We also were recording songs and collecting morphological measurements. And so the morphological measurements, the sample sizes are a little bit hard to tell. And when you're talking about differences of millimeters in wing length or millimeters in bill size, we haven't gotten as conclusive evidence of that. But Sean Roach, who's written a couple of Hermit Thrush song papers, helped collaborate on this piece of the project. He analyzed the song data. He's up in Nova Scotia. He looked at some of our song data and found that the birds at these more southern parks, Big Basin, Hindi Woods, and Humboldt Redwoods along the coast, kind of hung together, whereas Castle Crags and Del Norte had songs that were distinct from Big Basin and also distinct from each other, which is pretty cool. So anyhow, that's most of what I wanted to share with you today. I just want to thank especially all the folks at the California State Parks who helped with all the logistics around getting into these parks, especially when they were closed to the public. I just felt so incredibly privileged to have access. There were literally times when I think I was the only person walking around this 18,000 acre park by myself at dusk or dawn. And I just felt really privileged to have this opportunity. So lots of great folks who have helped in the field over the years, especially a couple of you who are out there in the audience, like Allison Connor, yay, and Hope Brady, yay, and then also some great folks who have helped with data analysis. And then again, just a huge shout out to California State Parks and the California State Parks Foundation, again, who helped fund this study. So thank you, everybody. And I would love to answer any questions either from the chat or if you want to ask something live. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. It's really interesting to hear about your work, and thank you so much for all you're doing for these hermit thrushes and studying how they're doing. It is sad to me to think, that these populations, some of them are dwindling and we're losing those beautiful songs that they're singing. I'm particularly partial to hermit thrush songs in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Absolutely. So we did have a few questions come in the chat. So I do want to get to those first before we go into other questions that people may have. But if you want to go back to, there was a slide, one of the first slides you showed with basically the blobs, right? The polygons for those, where those Bay Area birds ended up. Someone asked, why are there some of those polygons in the ocean?
Yeah, so it's an issue with the accuracy of the technology. So so one of these blobs represents the possible location of these birds. So like when you get your data back, like we talk about like, so breeding season is probably from we want to make sure we're not catching migrants. So you end up with all these data points. And you want to kind of restrict your breeding season window to maybe the very end of May to middle of July. And after that, after or before that, they might start moving around. So you get kind of a whole bunch of dots, you know, a whole bunch of different points. And this kernel density estimate is kind of a way of looking at where the most likely location of the bird within that kind of constellation of dots might be. And so, you know, the dot for each blob is what's called a centroid. So that's maybe the most likely location. But again, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, there's a pretty substantial error with geolocator. So he probably wasn't here. He was probably here on Haida Gwaii, also known as Queen Charlotte Island, or, you know, could have even been, you know, somewhere around the coast. Again, the geolocators, you know, they're not super accurate like a GPS tracking device, which has really much more precise readings.
Yeah, and that actually relates to the next question, which someone asked, what does KDE stand for? And you just explained.
Oh, yeah, kernel density estimate.
Yeah. All right, and then when you were talking about the birds at Big Basin, someone asked, how large is a typical territory?
So, so if you think about an acre being 0.13%, and this is post-fire, you know, 0.13% of, or you know, 13% of a bird's territory, then that bird might have, you know, maybe 8 to 12 acres. And one thing that's been really interesting, just after having spent so much time spot mapping and trying to figure out exactly like who's who and, you know, who's going where, is, you know, we want their territories to end up as these kind of like nice little like rectangles or blobs on a string. And that's not really how they end up being shaped. You know, maybe he's got this patch of trees that he's protecting, but then like maybe there's some water way over here. So he's kind of like got this more U-shaped territory. And then, you know, and then there's some overlap, and then you might have, you know, one female that's got 2 males, you know, so it's not super easy to define, but that's you know, that's probably about as good an estimate as you could come up with, is sort of maybe the 8 to 10 acres. And the thing is like, so, and because the habitat is so funky, you know, you've got like the good habitat that's right along the creeks or the water bodies. And so that may be kind of the core of their habitat, but maybe they've got a much bigger area they're accessing that's poor quality habitat. So they're spending most of their time along the water bodies, but then they're, you know, heading out into these lower quality areas to forage or, you know, just make sure their mates are okay or whatever. Yeah.
Okay. And then towards the end of your presentation, someone asked, what is the relationship between genetic structure and subspecies definitions?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the early ornithologists in most cases really seemed like they knew what they were doing. Like they, like a lot of the genetics work, and again, it depends on the species, you know, the actual bird that we're talking about. But they found that a lot of the early subspecies definitions are fairly consistent with the genetic markers. So basically, phenology represents or phenotype represents genotype, and that's not always the case. But like I said, for here we've got these, you know, this genetically distinct small group. Over here, we have a genetically distinct small group. And then these birds in the Sierra are actually kind of a mix between the two. And so what the early ornithologists may have identified as a separate subspecies is actually more of kind of, you know, you can think of it like a hybrid between the two. So maybe it's kind of somewhere between these two sizes, but it's got this kind of, and you can kind of actually see it right here where this number 7 is. You can kind of see that this number 7 corresponds to this 7 here. He's got somewhat of the, you know, the genetic makeup of one species in conjunction with one subspecies, it's kind of a mix of the two.
I do actually see a hand up now from Vivek, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Absolutely fascinating talk. I had no idea we had an almost endemic subspecies here. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
two quick questions. So yes, two quick questions. First one, is it at all diagnosable in the field, the subspecies here?
Yeah. So the hermit thrushes that breed in Big Basin are considerably smaller than the ones that winter in the Bay Area. And so like they differ by an average of maybe 3 to 4 grams in weight. I actually had to buy a different model of geolocator for the breeding subspecies than the wintering one, because they needed a smaller geolocator. They couldn't carry the geolocator that was heavier than we had used on the first study. And so, it's the kind of thing where if you've handled a lot of them, you would be able to recognize that difference. Like, for example, I was catching birds in, I think it was the year that I was retrieving the geolocators in Big Basin. And, they're all about the same size. And it was kind of middle of May. And I caught one bird where I was like, wow, this guy is just so much bigger. And I knew it was a different subspecies because it was just bigger. He wasn't yet in breeding condition. It was darker. So it's probably not something you might be able to find through your binoculars, but if you've handled enough of them and an aberrant one kind of shows up, then you can kind of see it.
Great, thank you. And the second quick question. So, so it was fascinating that even after the fire, with 97% of the forest burnt, almost half of them still nested. Do we have any data on the success of the nesting? Especially if they were doing some non-traditional nest sites.
Yeah. So when I was there, it was an absolutely crazy time. So I wasn't really setting out to define nest success. Just you really need a kind of a big team of people to be really out there in the field. Is that much to be doing that much observation. But what was happening was literally as breeding season was starting, these crews were coming in to remove hazard trees from along the roads and through campgrounds and right in the areas where my sites were. So they had contractors who were there trying to literally like racing ahead of these crews to see if they could find any birds' nests before they came in and like dropped trees everywhere and dragged them across the forest floor and et cetera. And so between myself and some of these contract biologists who were looking for nests, we were able to find some fledglings, and it kind of depended. Like we had one pair that I think had two broods. So some, they'll if they start early enough, they can raise young and then start another nest and raise more young. So we had one pair that seemed like they had a couple fledglings, and then but they lay usually 3 to 4 eggs. I think most often 4. But we never saw like one pair with 4 fledglings. That just was that is something that absolutely did not happen, and that often that even in a normal environment, it's rare for all of the nestlings to survive in a season. That's why they have 4 eggs and do this every year. Yeah, so we don't have great data on that. That would have been nice, but it was just such a chaotic time in the park that it was really almost impossible to try to capture that data of that kind of detail.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. So in the chat, we have a question about will hermit thrush fire orphans find refuge in suburbs? There are a few hermit thrushes in our neighborhood in the flatlands adjacent to hills and woodlands.
Right now, like in the winter, you'll have hermit thrushes kind of everywhere. So they'll be in lower elevation areas and higher elevation areas. And because like at Big Basin, you had birds that were wintering there of this other subspecies, like the ones we were catching at CCFS, and then you have a different subspecies that's there in the breeding season. So it is quite possible that the wintering birds who were going to Big Basin are not finding what they need there, and they're dispersing. I know that right after the fire, there were just like on some local chat groups and Facebook groups and stuff, a lot of people who had homes adjacent to the park were reporting on seeing more wildlife than in the past. So definitely birds birds and other types of wildlife were utilizing residential areas.
Okay, and then let's see, our next question. I was wondering about the projected loss of territory with climate change. Do you know why the projected range change is so significant? Is this predicated on loss of redwood forest or Doug fir habitat types?
So it probably has most to do with loss of habitat, drought, as you, the thought is that many species their ranges will move up higher in elevation. So they're seeking out colder areas. So they'll either move up in latitude or they'll move up in elevation. So if you go back to that slide, the original habitat is really in these mountainous areas. And if you think about that, it's kind of getting restricted to the highest peaks of that original distribution range.
And then going back also to fire. So Jan asked, would you expect a high degree of nest failure? I think you said that post-fire in other locations, you see continued decrease because birds don't return, possibly because of nest failure. Is that correct?
So essentially what would happen is that in the first year, the birds, so there's probably just a number of birds that didn't survive, adults and maybe recently fledged birds. So then, 1 year later in breeding season, you're just going to have a smaller number of birds that are returning to the site initially. And then some will arrive and they'll try to, the males will start singing and setting up territories. They'll try to find females. One of the really, really big problems, especially in this first year, was that there was so little cover that probably predation was really high. So there were the ravens, there were lots of ravens in the area. And, ravens and other corvids will raid nests. They'll eat the young, they'll eat eggs, they'll eat anything they can get a build on. And so probably that is part of the problem with nest failure. And then also in that first year, it was actually interesting because in April, it was what do you call it? A cicada, a brood cicada year. And so when I went in April, the place was just covered with cicadas. So there were probably, various wildlife species that were taking advantage of this initial explosion of cicadas all over the park. And so that probably actually helped hold them over because there was so little food available. There wasn't, there's no berries. The ground is just covered with ash. You turn it over, there's nothing living on the, you turn things over with your boot or whatever, and there's just very little life on the porous floor. So it's hard to think about what they were possibly feeding their young. There's just not a lot of food sources out there. So probably just literally very limited food sources is one of the issues with nest success.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you also know if the estimated territory sizes changed post-fire?
So I don't, well, yeah, so that is not something we looked at real specifically, but we, so probably what happened is that, birds before the fire were concentrated in these riparian areas because that's really great habitat. And then the post-fire numbers were probably also high in these riparian areas because they ended up being lower severity fire because there's more ground moisture, et cetera. And the birds would kind of be concentrated in those areas. So our numbers of around territory size and territory density were, again, really pretty rough estimates. But those were kind of the patterns that we were seeing.
Yeah. Okay. And I think we might have time for just one or maybe two more questions. So I'm going to keep going down the list here. But if there are more questions, I can email those to Allison and maybe you can help answer them and I can send those out to people. So yeah, awesome. Thanks. So
Thank you.
A question is, if any of these Big Basin birds were netted the first breeding season after the fire, were stress bars noted in their wing feathers?
So I didn't do any netting post-fire. Yeah, so I didn't have any birds in hand post-fire. The post-fire territory density estimates were based on the spot mapping, where we're out just actually looking for birds and recording all the detections. So yeah, so I'm not sure about that, but there was quite a few years between these, the 3 years that I did the capturing and tagging of the birds was 2013, 2014, and 2015. And so then the spot mapping occurred in 2021. So so I did go back in 2020 and saw maybe 2 individuals that I had actually banded all the way back in 2015 or 2014. So the birds, at least, 5 years old or 6 years old or something. But yeah, didn't have the handling of the birds post-fire. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I think that's going to be all the time we have, unfortunately, for questions. But again, I'll go ahead and email the rest of the questions out to Allison and get those answers to you all. Thank you again, Allison, for a great talk.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for attending, and thanks for your great questions. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share the work with you. And for those of you who are still online, if you can get to Big Basin and see the changes, they've opened it up in sort of a limited extent, and I just would recommend, if you can get there and can get there early in the morning or stay late in the evening, that's when the birds are really singing. It's just a really fascinating experience if it's something you've never been able to enjoy. But some of those other parks that I mentioned in my slides are other great places to go hear and see hermit thrushes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much again for that, Allison. And thanks again to everybody for attending. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.